Thank you very much. I was asked to speak on the theme of the unfinished battle for LGBT rights in Britain. So, what is yet to be done in terms of the human rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people in this country. So the starting point has got to be all the amazing things that have been achieved. If you think about it, as recently as 1999, Britain had by volume the largest number of anti-gay laws of any country in the world. Some of them dating back centuries. And that is truly, truly shocking, that we as a democracy had so many laws that criminalized and otherwise discriminated against LGBT people. Take, for example, the law against anal sex. It was passed in the reign of King Henry VIII in 1533. It stipulated death by hanging. It was amended in 1861 to life imprisonment. In 1967, it was further amended to a maximum of 5 years jail. But that law was not finally repealed until 2003. You've all heard of Oscar Wilde, the great Irish playwright, who was jailed in 1895 for the crime of gross indecency. Gross indecency simply means any sexual contact between men other than anal intercourse. So it can mean oral sex, mutual masturbation, touching, and even kissing. That remained a crime also until 2003. So it was only the passage of the Sexual Offences Act in 2003 that removed homophobic discrimination from the criminal law. It's only 13 years ago the criminal law has not discriminated against gay and bisexual men. In fact, the first reform, post-1999, was the end to the ban on LGBT people serving in the armed forces, followed by the equalisation of the age of consent at 16 for everyone. And then a succession of other reforms followed. The ban on same-sex couples fostering and adopting children was lifted. Section 28, which prohibited the so-called promotion of homosexuality in schools, was repealed. Legislation was passed to give gay people protection against discrimination in employment. Until 2004, it was lawful by default for an employer to refuse a gay person a job or to sack them from their job simply because they were gay. It wasn't until 2007 that other forms of discrimination were outlawed. So until 2007, a landlord could refuse to let a property to an LGBT person, or could evict an LGBT tenant, and there was no legal redress. Advertisers, schools, businesses were all allowed by law to discriminate against LGBT people right up until 2007. Another big reform, of course, was the enactment of civil partnerships in 2004, 2005. The first ever legal recognition of same-sex relationships, followed up in 2013 with the Same-Sex Marriage Act, the first time LGBT people could marry lawfully. So you can see that that's just a snapshot of the range of reforms since 1999. That has been the fastest, most successful law reform campaign in British history. There's never been any other law reform campaign which has repealed so many discriminatory laws in such a short space of time. And that success is not, of course, just down to the LGBT community, but very importantly to our straight friends and allies. Without their support, those reforms would not have happened. and I pay tribute to members of Parliament from all parties who did support those positive changes. But as I said from the title of my talk, there is still unfinished business. And I'm going to just talk briefly about some of those things that remain to yet be achieved. I mentioned same-sex marriage, which you know was legislated in 2013. It was not equal marriage. It was same-sex marriage, but not equal marriage. We now have segregation in marriage law. Think about segregation. In apartheid South Africa and in the deep south of the United States in the 1950s and 60s, they had segregation. Different laws for black people and white people. Well, today in Britain, we have segregation in marriage law. We've got two different marriage laws. One is for heterosexual couples, the other is for homosexual couples. So under the 1949 Marriage Act, only straight couples can marry. Under the 2013 Marriage Act, only gay couples can marry. So we've got two separate laws. Now, interestingly, what the government could and should have done, instead of passing a whole new law, was simply repeal the ban on same-sex marriage. Under the 1949 Marriage Act, there is no prohibition on same-sex marriage. The 1949 Marriage Act, the main marriage law of this country, does not state that marriage partners have to be male and female. It just says two persons. The ban on same-sex marriage was only introduced in 1971 in response to attempts by same-sex couples and transgender people to marry. So the ban is very recent, and all the government really had to do was just repeal the ban and let everything revert to the 1949 Marriage Act. They didn't do that. They chose segregation instead, which of course is not equality. And within that legislation, there are a number of key issues that are not equality. So, for example, if you're in a heterosexual marriage under the 1949 Marriage Act and your partner dies, you as the surviving spouse can inherit all of their pension contributions going back to the first year they made their contribution, which might be 1960. But if you're in a same-sex marriage or a same-sex civil partnership and your partner dies, you can only inherit your partner's contributions since 2005, or in some cases, 1988. So if your partner had been contributing to his or her pension since 1960, you'll lose more than 20 or 30 years of his or her pension contribution. So that's a real major financial penalty for same-sex couples, whether in a civil partnership or a civil marriage. There is discrimination in the inheritance of pensions. There are other issues too. In Northern Ireland, there is still a ban on same-sex marriage. Northern Ireland, a part of the United Kingdom, 5 times the legislature there has sought to legislate equal marriage. 5 times it's been blocked, primarily by the Democratic Unionist Party. In Northern Ireland also, there is still a lifetime ban on gay and bisexual men donating blood. In the rest of the country, there's a 12-month deferral period. Gay and bisexual men can donate blood, provided they haven't had oral or anal sex in the preceding 12 months. But in Northern Ireland, it's a lifetime blanket ban, even if a gay or bisexual man tests HIV negative, even if they always practice safer sex, and even if they last had sex 20 or 30 years ago. It's crazy. It's not medically or scientifically sound. Another issue is that all the fantastic equality laws we have still contain a qualified exemption for religious organizations. Not just places of worship, but faith-run schools, hospitals, nursing homes, and shelters for the homeless are allowed by law to refuse to employ an LGBT person or to refuse to provide services to LGBT people if they can demonstrate that it's necessary in order to maintain their religious ethos. So that is a unique exemption. No other social institutions are exempt from the equality laws, only religious bodies. Now, I respect the right of people to hold different religious views. I wish they were supportive of LGBT rights, because after all, discrimination against LGBT people is not a Christian value. But even if they hold those views, which they're entitled to in a free society, I don't think they should have a right to discriminate. Discrimination against people for any reason is wrong. Another issue that still remains is the epidemic of homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic bullying in schools. I don't know about your school, but across the country, 50% of LGBT kids say they have experienced bullying at school. And nearly half of all schools have no anti-bullying program that specifically addresses the bullying of LGBT kids. Half. And we're talking about teasing, name-calling, but also threats, menaces, and in some cases, actual physical violence against LGBT pupils in the classroom or the playground or on the way home from school. That is truly, truly shocking. We also know that across the country, 1/3 of all LGBT people have been victims of hate crime. That's nearly 1 million LGBT people in this country have been victims of homophobic, biphobic, or transphobic hate crime. Again, ranging from abuse and threats to actual physical violence. You may remember in 2009, only 7 years ago, Ian Bainham, an elderly gay man, was walking through Trafalgar Square in the heart of London, and he was set upon by a mob and beaten to death. Beaten to death in Trafalgar Square in 2009. Now, homophobic murders are much less common today than they were, but they still happen, and more dramatic and more common are violent assaults that don't result in people dying, but leave them with broken teeth, black eyes, broken bones, stab wounds, and so on. Those kind of hate crimes against LGBT people happen every week around the country. I was just reading the other day an example of a young gay man leaving a gay club was set upon by a gang and very, very badly beaten. A few days before, a lesbian woman had been set upon in the street near her home because neighbours thought she was a lesbian and didn't like her and felt it was okay to go and beat her. Those things are still happening. We also know that when LGBT people flee persecution in very homophobic countries like Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Uganda, and Jamaica, when they come here to seek refuge, in nearly all cases, they are refused on their first application. Even when they present evidence, even when it's known that the country they are fleeing has a notorious record of arrests, imprisonment, torture, and even mob murder of LGBT people. You may have seen on YouTube some of the videos from Uganda and Nigeria of mobs setting upon a person known or suspected to be gay and beating them with sticks, then stoning them, then pouring petrol over them while they're still alive and burning them. That's happening. But our Home Office will try to send LGBT refugees back to those countries. And the only reason some LGBT people do eventually win asylum is because my organisation and others help and support them. Help them get the evidence to demonstrate what they've been through. We help get them referrals to medical doctors who can examine them and attest to their wounds and injuries and their psychological trauma. Without our help, many, many more would be sent back. Some of you will be aware of the 8 Jamaican reggae and dancehall singers, like Buju Banton, Elephant Man, Vibes Cartel, TOK, and so on, who have over the years put out music tracks that openly encourage the shooting, burning, hanging, and drowning of LGBT people. They exhort people to go out and kill LGBT people. For many years, they were allowed by the police and Home Office to come to Britain and perform those songs. The BBC, funded by the taxpayer, played those tracks on radio until we had a big campaign to stop them. Now, I don't believe that inciting violence is legitimate. Indeed, it is a criminal offence. The question is, why were these singers, even to this day, never, ever prosecuted? If they'd been a white supremacist singer advocating killing black people, if they'd been an anti-Semitic singer advocating killing Jewish people, if they'd been an anti-Muslim bigot advocating killing Muslim people, they would have been arrested and sent to prison. But not one of them has ever even been prosecuted. It shows the double standards. And to give another example, in 2004, an Islamist extremist preacher, Sheikh Abdullah al-Faisal, urged his followers to go out and kill Jews and Hindus. He was arrested, put on trial, convicted, and jailed for 9 years. At around the same time, another Islamist extremist, Imam Abdul Muhid, advocated his followers should kill homosexuals. Despite 4 witnesses, he wasn't even taken to court. What I'm trying to highlight is the double standards. It's no good having good equality laws if they're not effectively interpreted and enforced. And so often, LGBT people don't get a fair crack of the whip when it comes to legal protection. The final issue I'd raise is, I mentioned earlier, the blood ban. You know, we now no longer have a lifetime ban on gay and bisexual men donating blood in England, Wales, and Scotland. But we still do in Northern Ireland. Now it's, as I said, a 12-month deferral period. If you're gay and you're bisexual and you've had any kind of sexual contact with a man, particularly anal or oral sex, you can't donate blood for a further 12 months. Now, the intention is, of course, to safeguard and protect the blood supply. But it's based upon a generalization. Most gay and bisexual men do not have HIV and will never have HIV. So why should they all be subjected to this blanket 12-month deferral period? Moreover, all blood donations are now tested in 3 different ways. And they can detect an infection that maybe only happened 2 or 3 weeks earlier. So in fact, what we really need is a deferral period of 1 or maybe 2 or 3 months at the most. And particularly for gay and bisexual men who no longer have any kind of risky sex, who always practice safer sex, and if they test HIV negative, there's no reason for them to have a deferral period at all. Again, it's based on stereotyping and generalizations. Because under the current rules, a heterosexual businessman who goes to New York and has lots of unsafe sex with lots of women in a city where there's a major HIV epidemic, he's allowed to donate blood. So why the double standards? Why can a heterosexual businessman go to a very HIV intensive city and have unprotected sex with umpteen women? He can donate blood, but a gay and bisexual man who's tested HIV negative, who's monogamous, who never does risky sex, he can't. Or can't for 12 months. That is not fair. My final point is that we have made, despite these ongoing unresolved issues, we have made great progress in Britain. But in the rest of the world, things are still far from anywhere near that. Of the 193 nations in the world today, nearly 80 still have a total prohibition on same-sex relations, with penalties ranging from a few years imprisonment right up to life imprisonment and even execution in about half a dozen Muslim-majority countries. Execution, death penalty in 2016. Unbelievable. And of course, that's just the one fragment of it. In lots of these countries, if you don't get arrested, tortured, or jailed or killed by the state, you're at high risk of being killed by mobs. You know, people taking the law into their own hands. So-called honor killings in the Middle East and parts of Africa to preserve the family and community's honor. They will, in some cases, not in every case, but in some cases, mobs will seek to kill gay people. And sometimes they succeed. So we have a long way to go on the global scale. For the vast majority of LGBT people on this planet, whose numbers probably run to close to 600 million LGBT people in the world today, for the vast majority, they have no proper legal rights. They are criminalized, subjected to discrimination and social persecution. So when I look at LGBT rights, I see this struggle on a par with the struggle for women's rights and equality, on a par with the struggle for black rights and equality. It's about ensuring human rights for people who happen to love a person of the same sex. And that is a right that is a human right and should apply to everyone. My motivation is very simple. I don't accept the world as it is. I dream of what the world could be, and then I work with others to help make it happen. Thank you.
Who follow the news very closely may be aware of what's become known as the gay cake story. And of course you were opposed to the discrimination at the time, but then it seemed you were also opposed to the judgment that was made as a result of it. I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
Mm-hmm. For those of you who don't know, Asher's Bakery in Belfast, Northern Ireland, refused a request by a gay man, Gareth Lee, to make a cake decorated with the message, support gay marriage. Gareth Lee brought a legal case against Asher's Bakery on the grounds of discrimination. And I initially supported him for two reasons. First of all, Asher's, in their advertising, said they were willing to make a cake decorated with any message that a customer wished. Yet when Gareth Lee presented his request for a message, support gay marriage, Asher's refused. So that to me was misleading advertising and the breaching of a promise and a contract. They'd not honoured their pledge to make a cake with any message the customer wanted. The other reason I supported the action was because I feared that in Northern Ireland, with a history of sectarian political division, if they were compelled to produce a cake with that message, perhaps other businesses could be compelled to produce cakes with other messages, or print t-shirts with other messages, or print leaflets or books or posters with other messages with which they disagreed. And that might be exploited by loyalists against Republicans or by Republicans against loyalists. But after the court found in favour of Gareth Lee and said that Asher's had discriminated, I began to look at the case again in more detail and read the judgment. At the end of the day, I concluded that Asher's had not discriminated against Gareth because he was gay. That would have been wrong. It would have been unlawful, and rightfully so, because discrimination against people is always wrong. But what they'd done is, Asher's had refused to aid a political message, support gay marriage. And as much as I disagree with them, I think in a free society they should not be compelled by law to make a message or aid a message with which they disagree. If they were to be compelled, then it would work the other way around as well. You know, a gay baker could be forced by law to bake a cake with a message against gay marriage or with homophobic abuse. So if a gay baker shouldn't be compelled to make a cake with a homophobic message, why should another baker, a Christian baker in this instance, be compelled to bake a cake with a pro-gay marriage message? Likewise, if the judgment against Asher's stands, if continued, there's a requirement that businesses produce any lawful message, then it would presumably mean that a Muslim printer could be forced by law to print the cartoons of Muhammad, or a Jewish printer could be forced to publish a book by a Holocaust denier. I don't think there should be that kind of compulsion in a free and open society. I agree the issue is complex, but I decided to err on the side of freedom of expression, conscience, and belief, even though I totally disagree with Asher's. I totally agree. They are homophobic. They don't support gay equality. They think the law should discriminate against gay people. That is wrong. But nevertheless, in a free society, they have a right to hold that view and to not be required to aid a political message with which they disagree.
I'm sure there are some other questions as well. Yeah, back.
My question is, I would guess that you're aware of the recent referendum in Slovenia as regards to gay marriage, where a majority of the population voted against it. What are your thoughts on that, where the population, rather than just the government, decided that they didn't want it?
Well, this isn't the only instance of where that kind of plebiscite has been held. And you may know that only just a few days ago, in Switzerland, they very narrowly defeated a referendum to ban gay marriage. It was tied up in a wider referendum about tax reform, but it came very, very close to also outlawing same-sex marriage. Obviously, one wants to bring about progressive social change with public support. You want to carry the people with you. We want equality, we deserve equality, and we want the public to support that. But at the end of the day, I don't think that issues of equality and human rights should be subject to popular votes. Because I don't believe that a majority ever has a right to deny rights to a minority. To me, human rights trump majority voting. So regardless of what the public may think, we don't support the persecution of black people, Chinese people, Muslims, Jews, Asians, disabled people. We don't support that. Even if a majority of the public said they supported such discrimination, I hope that most of us would say no, that is a step too far. Human rights trump majority voting.
What would you... Don't you then have an issue, though, with the conflict, the fact that the human rights are ultimately the result of popular voting anyway? What we have written down in Geneva as human rights are set down by majority vote.
Well, obviously, if the majority vote in favour of human rights, that is the preferable outcome. That's what we want. But, the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to which every country in the world is signed up to, states categorically that all human beings are born free and equal, and that governments are required to ensure equal treatment and protection against discrimination to all citizens. It also states that everyone has the right to marry. It doesn't say only heterosexuals have the right to marry. It says everyone has the right to marry. So if you use international human rights law, to which all nations have signed up, as your benchmark, then it's very clear the obligation is on governments to ensure that there are human rights for everyone, including LGBT people.
Others? Yeah. Two parts of my question. Firstly, would you say it is actually possible to, from the influence of the media, people around you, to change to have your sexual orientation change? And also, as you just said about the human rights thing, would you then not say that it is irrevocable, that the democracy cannot actually achieve equality because the root of democracy is the majority wins?
Well, you're right. I mean, the basic ethos of democracy is majority rule. But over time, we have, as nations of the world, qualified that by saying that even if a majority of the population or a majority party in Parliament decides something, they haven't got a right to override basic fundamental human rights. That is a benchmark, a bulwark against oppressive governments. And the reason why the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed was largely in response to the experience of Nazism in Germany before and during the Second World War. There, the Nazis were the biggest party in 1943. But most people accept that did not make them right. It did not give them the authority to embark on their program of persecution and terrorization against Jewish, disabled, and many other persecuted minorities. So I think on that score, human rights are there for a purpose. They're there to act as a brake upon excessive tyrannical government. What was your first point about?
Is it actually possible to be influenced by media people around you to actually have your sexual orientation change?
All the evidence shows that sexual orientation is set down before you're even born and in the immediate years afterwards. The two major causes of sexual orientation are genetic influences, which are quite substantial, and hormonal influences in the womb. They're the two major factors that cause someone to be straight, gay, bisexual, or transgender. Some studies have found that where you have identical twins, where one twin is gay, the other twin will also be gay in somewhere between 30 and 50% of cases. Different studies have come out with different results. One study found that where one brother is gay, in an identical twin, this is, where one identical twin is gay, in 52% of cases, the other brother is also gay, which is much higher than the general average of gayness in the wider population, which is about maybe 5 to 10%. We also know that lots of aspects of physical attributes are influenced by hormonal influences in the womb. And we know there are differences between gay men and straight men, and between straight women and lesbian women. And that these relate to particular hormonal markers. So, for example, when it comes to gay men versus straight men, the correlation between the pointing finger and this finger, the finger length ratio, is on average different between gay and straight men. I've actually got a straight man's finger ratio, but I'm an exception. On average, there are differences. And I don't want to disappoint anybody, but another hormonal influence in the womb is penis size. And on average, gay men have larger penises. So there's a whole host of other factors as well, but that would show that hormonal influences are very significant. Once this is all set down biologically, and perhaps in the first couple of years or few years of childhood, you can't change that later on. All you can do is accept what is there. So I thought I was straight, and I was dating girls until I was 16 or 17. But when I realized I was gay, I realized actually my desire for women was actually, it was more mental than physical, sexual, or emotional. I have friends who have in late life switched. So I've got a friend who for 20 years, from his early 20s, had a relationship with a man. Then when that relationship broke up, he happened to meet a woman who he fell in love with, and he's still with her. Now he says, I'm still gay. I haven't stopped being gay. It just happens that I've discovered a part of me that I never realized was there. It's not that he turned straight or changed. It's just that that root of heterosexual desire was there but buried, and happened to come to the fore when his same-sex relationship broke down, and he happened to meet a very exceptional, beautiful, intelligent, warm-hearted woman. Many of you have perhaps heard of the pop singer, the 1970s pop singer Tom Robinson, who was an out gay man. He wrote a gay anthem called "Sing If You're Glad to Be Gay." You can find it on YouTube. He had a similar experience. He met a woman, fell in love, and they are still together to this day. He never thought he would ever fall in love with a woman or be able to have sex with a woman, but he did. But he still says today, and I saw him last weekend, he still says, I'm a gay man who happens to be in love with a woman. I still have gay desires, but I've also discovered I have straight desires. There's a very famous example in the research by Alfred Kinsey. He documented the case of a woman who'd been happily married to a man for many, many years. I can't remember how many, but I think 15 or so years. Then she met a woman and fell in love with the woman. Again, a total surprise. She never thought she would have any sexual or emotional desire for women. but she did. And they lived together happily for another 10 or 12 years. And then she met a man and had an affair with him. So she was a mixture of same-sex and opposite-sex desire and attraction. It shows not that you can change, but that for most of us, we're not 100% straight or 100% gay. Most of us are a mixture. We may never express it, we may never even recognize it. But as studies of the animal kingdom have shown, human sexuality is far more diverse, fluid, and amorphous than most of us recognize. So I'm very happy to put my hand up and say that some years ago, I had a fantastic heterosexual wet dream. It came as a complete shock, but I wasn't horrified. I was shocked and surprised because I didn't expect it. But I thought to myself, well, obviously there is somewhere a fragment in me of opposite sex desire and attraction. I have never acted upon it and don't wish to, but I'm happy and relaxed about it. So basically the bottom line is, you can't change your sexual orientation, but you can accept it, and it sometimes can evolve. You can discover aspects to your sexuality that perhaps you never knew you had.
Are there any other questions? Yeah.
Keep mentioning how change in later life, but isn't it quite possible for someone just to be bisexual and then have just discovered their gay side to start with, and just discover that they might actually have a heterosexual side as well? Doesn't mean they're changing their sexuality, they look like being bisexual all the time.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say, that you don't change your sexuality, the roots are there, but perhaps you just never recognized it. But I think, lots of people from Sigmund Freud to anthropologists have suggested that bisexuality is the natural human condition, that all of us have a bisexual potential, and that all of us may, in the right circumstances, experience both opposite sex and same-sex desires. So, for example, traditionally in all male institutions like public schools, the military, and prisons, a lot of ostensibly heterosexual men will have same-sex experiences. And they will be able to function and get, full arousal having sex with a man, even though they would never ever define themselves as gay. If you look at like some tribal peoples in developing countries, traditionally bisexuality has been a totally natural, normal part of their culture. There's been never any fuss about, if you're gay or you're straight, they would never use those terms, of course, but if a person is attracted to an opposite sex or same-sex person, that's just part of the spectrum. And we see it in all other animal species. There's a famous book called Biological Exuberance by Bruce Bagamel, which looks at, I think, about 450 intensive studies of animal species. These are major, major studies. And in every single one, they discover the full range of sexuality. They discover heterosexuality, homosexuality, and bisexuality. This led him to conclude that sexual fluidity and diversity is part of the natural spectrum of all animal species, human and non-human.
Yeah, but why would bisexuality be the norm, considering kind of evolution, to ensure reproduction? Why would bisexuality be the norm amongst the animal kingdom?
Well, of course, manifestations of bisexuality and homosexuality, as in the human species, tend to be less prevalent in other animal species. So that means that the predominant sexual expression is of opposite sex attraction and consequent reproduction. That is why, even in these societies, like in some of the South Pacific islands, where homosexuality and bisexuality was quite not common, heterosexuality was still always the majority. And that ensured the reproduction of those societies. If you look, for example, at some tribal peoples in Papua New Guinea, in some tribes, all young boys go through a homosexual sort of, not exactly a marriage, but a relationship with an older warrior. So from the age of puberty, young boys will be assigned to an older unmarried male warrior who will teach them the male arts of hunting and fishing, and all the male tasks. And part of this relationship is a sexual one. And then when those young boys pass through the rites of passage to manhood and they themselves become warriors, they end that relationship with that warrior and they take a younger person. But in all instances, once the older warrior has gone through this stage of mentoring the younger person, they will go on and get married and have children. So overall, the majority is maintained in terms of heterosexuality and the reproduction of the species. But having said that, there's a little catch. If from today there was never again a single act of heterosexual sex between men and women, if no man or woman ever again in history had sex, we could still maintain and survive the human species, because we have donor insemination and surrogacy. And as you will be aware, thousands of same-sex couples in this country have children through donor insemination and surrogacy. And so do some straight couples who, for various reasons, can't have children because they're not fertile and so on. So we don't need heterosexuality to reproduce the human species. We now have the simple technology of donor insemination to do that.
We've got time for one more question.
Are you recently been labelled transphobic or signing a letter supporting Jermaine Greer and her right to exercise free speech? I was wondering if you actually agree with that as a use of trans.
For those who didn't hear, I've been criticised for signing a letter supporting the right of various people to free speech, including Jermaine Greer. I've been accused of being of transphobia as a result. But of course, I don't agree with Jermaine Greer and other feminists who are against transgender people. I think they have very old-fashioned, backward ideas. And I have spoken against them, I've campaigned against them, I've protested against them. But because I'm a Democrat, because I believe in the human right of freedom of expression, I believe that they have a right to speak. The best way to undermine and overturn transphobia is by challenging those ideas with better arguments, with reason and with evidence, not by bans and censorship. Bans and censorship very, very rarely work. They just suppress an idea. They don't challenge and expose it. So I think it's far more effective for people to go on a stage with Jermaine Greer and so on and challenge her face to face over the terrible, terrible things she said about transgender people. I think those ideas need to be challenged and need to be protested. But in a free and democratic society, I don't think it's right that she be gagged. And in many instances, she and others have been banned even though they were never going to speak about trans issues. They're going to speak about literature or art or something else. But because of a past statement, they were refused the right to speak, or when they had already been invited and agreed to speak, they had that invitation withdrawn. So to me, free speech is one of the most important of all human rights. It should only be limited in the following situations. When a person says false, damaging things about another person, such as that they are a rapist or a tax fraudster, or if they engage in threats, menaces, or incitements to violence. Those are the only legitimate reasons I can see for limiting free speech. Otherwise, disagreeable opinions, offensive opinions, should be allowed to be expressed, but not given a free pass. They should be protested against. We should challenge anybody who rails against trans people or anybody else. We should challenge them and defeat them in open debate. That's the most effective and best way to win and resolve that issue. If we go down the road to bans, where do you start? Where do you end up? You know, it's not a good idea to start allowing people to say, oh, I'm offended, you should be banned. Some of the most important people in history were incredibly offensive. Galileo Galilei, Charles Darwin, Sigmund Freud. Ideas caused immense offense, particularly to the church, when they spoke out. Wouldn't it have been terrible if they'd been banned because they'd caused an offense? I don't like causing offense. I don't think people should cause offense. But sometimes to challenge injustice, actually, you need to cause offense. And that is a right. There's no right to not be offended. No right at all. Being offended is sometimes part and parcel of the process of open debate. Thank you all. Thank you all very much. I mean, if you're interested, please go to my website, petertatchell.net. You'll find a whole archive of articles, news releases, statements, speeches, videos, and whatever subject you're interested in and working on at school, apart from perhaps maths and science, whatever subject you're working on, there's probably something on that website you can find useful. So there's a whole range of issues, as we've heard. Feel free, and if you're really interested, you can click on the Join Us button in the top right-hand corner. Give us your email address, it's totally free, and we'll keep you apprised about our campaigns. But well done, and I'll leave you with my final thought. This is my motto: don't accept the world as it is, dream of what the world could be, and then help make it happen. Thank you.